Her father dragged her into the freezing rain, throwing her at the feet of the city's most ruthless crime lord. Take the fat one, Richard spat a desperate bid to clear a $15 million blood debt while saving his favored, beautiful daughter. He thought he was handing Clara over to be tortured, mocked, and destroyed. He thought it was the ultimate punishment. But Dominic Rossi didn't look at her with disgust. He looked at her like a weapon, and together they were about to tear her father's empire completely to the ground. The mahogany doors of Richard Moretti's private study swung open with a violence that made the crystal decanters on the cart rattle. Clara stood in the hallway, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled the sleeves of her oversized charcoal grey cardigan down over her knuckles, a nervous habit she'd developed over 24 years of trying to shrink herself. At a size 18, shrinking was impossible in the Moretti household, a place where perfection was demanded, and physical appearance was the only currency that mattered. Inside the study stood Dominic Rossi. He was a ghost story whispered among the Chicago elite, a man who had taken control of the North Side Syndicate at just 32 after his uncle's sudden, bloody demise. Dominic didn't look like the street thugs her father normally employed. He wore a tailored midnight blue suit that cost more than a luxury sedan, his dark hair immaculately swept back, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in Clara's veins, hollow obsidian and utterly devoid of mercy. Her father Richard was sweating through his bespoke shirt. He had gambled heavily on a downtown real estate development scheme using syndicate money. The city zoning board had flipped, the feds had raided the site, and the $15 million Richard owed the Rossi family had vanished into thin air. "I need time, Dominic," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking. Clara had never heard her father beg. He was a tyrant, a man who threw plates at the wall if his steak was overcooked, a man who told Clara she was a repulsive embarrassment to the family name every time she walked into a room. "Time is a luxury for men who pay their debts," Richard Dominic said. His voice was quiet, a low, rumbling baritone that didn't need volume to command the room. "You have no money. You have no assets that aren't already seized. The penalty for stealing from my family is blood. You know the rules." Richard's eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on the framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of Sophia Clara's younger sister. Sophia was a 21-year-old former pageant queen, all golden hair, size 2 waist, and venomous smiles. Dominic saw the look. "A marriage?" Dominic stated smoothly. "An old-fashioned blood pact. It binds your remaining loyalists to me and ensures you never cross me again. Give me your daughter, Richard. She comes with me tonight. If she gives me an heir, your debt is forgiven. If you refuse, I will have Lorenzo paint this study with your brains." Clara watched from the crack in the door, her breath hitching. Sophia. He wanted Sophia. Her father would never give up his prized possession, his beautiful bargaining chip. Richard's face contorted in panic. He couldn't sacrifice Sophia to a mob boss. She was engaged to a state senator's son, a union that would bring the Morettis legitimate political power. His desperate eyes snapped toward the doorway. He saw Clara's shadow. "Clara," Richard barked, the venom instantly returning to his voice. "Get in here." Clara froze her stomach, dropping into an endless abyss. Trembling, she pushed the door open, stepping into the dim light of the study. She kept her head down, avoiding Dominic's gaze, feeling the immediate familiar shame of her body taking up space in a room where she was unwanted. "You want a daughter, Rossi?" Richard sneered, grabbing Clara by the upper arm and dragging her forward with bruising force. He shoved her toward the center of the Persian rug. Clara stumbled, barely catching her balance. "Take her. Take the fat pig. She's useless to me anyway. You want a Moretti bride to humiliate me? Take this one. I assure you, Looking at her every day is punishment enough." The silence in the room became absolute. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears prickling her lashes. This was it. Her father had finally found a way to dispose of her, using her as literal garbage to pay off his debts. She waited for Dominic to laugh, to pull his gun and shoot her father for the insult. How could he accept a woman society deemed invisible, especially when offered as a cruel joke? Dominic slowly turned his gaze to Clara. She braced herself for the disgust. He looked at her trembling shoulders, her downcast eyes, the way she instinctively tried to hide behind her own arms. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. "Her, Dominic," finally said. It wasn't a question. "She's yours," Richard spat, eagerly stepping back. "No dowry. Take her and the debt is clear. If she disgusts you too much, throw her to your men. I don't care." Clara let out a small, involuntary whimper. Dominic's jaw tightened infinitesimally. He stepped forward, closing the distance between him and Clara. He was a head taller than her, radiating a dangerous cold heat. He didn't look at Richard as he spoke. "Pack nothing," Dominic said, his eyes fixed on Clara's face. "Whatever she has in this house is tainted." "Wait, Dominic, we have a deal, right?" Richard pressed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "The debt." "The debt is settled, Richard," Dominic said softly. He finally looked at the older man, and the promise of violence in his eyes was absolute. "But if you ever speak to my future wife in that tone again, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to my dogs." Richard blanched, stumbling back a step. Dominic turned his attention back to Clara. He didn't grab her. He didn't shove her. He simply extended his hand palm up, clad in a black leather glove. "Walk with me, Clara." Stunned her mind, completely blank. With shock, Clara looked at his hand. Slowly, with a shaking arm, she placed her fingers in his. His grip was firm, surprisingly gentle, and entirely inescapable. As he led her out of the study, leaving her father paralyzed in fear, Clara realized her life had just ended, and she had no idea what nightmare was about to begin. The ride to Winnetka was entirely silent. Clara sat rigidly in the back of the armored Maybach, pressing herself against the door to ensure she didn't accidentally brush against the man sitting beside her. The scent of him cedar expensive bergamot, and a faint metallic trace of something dangerous filled the cabin. She stared out the window at the rain-slicked streets of Chicago blurring past. She had been traded, given away like a damaged piece of furniture. A heavy, suffocating knot of grief formed in her throat. She wasn't grieving leaving her father. She was grieving the utter worthlessness of her own existence. Richard's words echoed in her ears. "Take the fat pig. Throw her to your men." She stole a terrified glance at Dominic. He was staring out the opposite window, swirling a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid. What did a man like him want with her? Was this a long, drawn-out psychological torture? Would he lock her in a basement? The car turned off Sheridan Road, passing through massive wrought-iron gates that groaned open to reveal a sprawling stone estate overlooking Lake Michigan. It looked like a modern fortress, cold and impenetrable. When the car stopped Dominic's enforcer, a massive man named Matteo, with a scar running down his neck, opened the door. Clara hesitated, her legs feeling like lead. "Come," Dominic said, stepping out into the light rain. She followed him up the sprawling stone steps. Inside the mansion was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, dark hardwood, and minimalist modern art. It was immaculate, silent, and intimidating. An older woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun stood waiting in the foyer, her hands clasped in front of a pristine black uniform. "Mrs. Gable," Dominic said, handing his damp overcoat to a waiting shadow of a man. "This is Clara. She is the lady of the house now. Show her to the master suite. Clara's head snapped up. The master suite, Mrs. Gable bowed her head. Yes, Mr. Rossi. Right this way, Miss Clara. Clara looked at Dominic, panic finally breaking through her silence. I don't understand. Dominic paused on his way toward what looked like a library. He turned slowly, his dark eyes analyzing her. What is there to understand? My father. Clara stammered, her hands trembling as she clutched her cardigan. He gave me to you as a joke, as a punishment. You don't have to pretend. Where are you actually putting me? Dominic's expression darkened, an icy fury settling over his features. But it wasn't directed at her. He took 3 long strides back toward her, stopping just inches away. Clara flinched, expecting a strike. It never came. Richard Moretti is a foolish, dead man walking... Dominic said, his voice a lethal whisper. He thinks he insulted me by offering you. He thinks your worth is dictated by the numbers on a scale and the cruelty of his own mind. Let me make this very clear to you, Clara. He reached out his gloved hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before his knuckles gently brushed against her cheek. The touch was so unexpected, so entirely devoid of violence, that Clara stopped breathing. You are not a joke in this house, Dominic continued softly. You are my fiancé. You will sleep in my suite. You will eat at my table. And anyone who looks at you with anything less than absolute reverence will lose their eyes. Do you understand me? Clara couldn't speak. She just gave a frantic, tiny nod. Dominic stepped back, the cold mask slipping back into place. Mrs. Gable will attend to you. Get some rest. Tomorrow the Taylors arrive. As Dominic disappeared into the shadows of the mansion, Clara followed the housekeeper up the sweeping marble staircase. Her mind was reeling. She was placed into a suite that was larger than her entire apartment had been before she moved back into her father's house. A massive king-sized bed, a fireplace crackling warmly, and a bathroom made entirely of black marble. She walked into the bathroom and stared at herself in the massive mirror. She saw the roundness of her face, the heavy slope of her shoulders, the curves she had spent a lifetime trying to hide in baggy clothes. Why hadn't he put her in a servant's room? Why the master suite? A terrifying thought crossed her mind. He's fattening the calf before the slaughter. The next morning, she awoke to a soft knock. Mrs. Gable entered, followed by 3 women, carrying rolling racks of clothing, measuring tapes and fabric swatches. Mr. Rossi requested a complete wardrobe replacement for you, Miss Clara, Mrs. Gable said smoothly. I can just order things online, Clara said, shrinking back against the pillows. She hated being measured. Taylors always sighed, poked, and made subtle comments about her proportions. Mr. Rossi's future wife does not wear off-the-rack clothing, the lead tailor, a severe-looking Frenchwoman, said briskly. For the next 4 hours, Clara was measured, draped, and fitted. To her profound shock, none of the women sighed. None of them suggested corsets to minimize her waist or black fabrics to slim her down. Instead, they wrapped her in emerald silks, deep sapphire velvets, and rich burgundies. They measured the curve of her hips and the fullness of her chest, not as problems to be solved, but as a canvas to be draped. By late afternoon, the room was filled with boxes of custom lingerie cashmere sweaters and stunning dresses designed specifically for a plus-sized frame, celebrating it rather than hiding it. Just as the tailors left, Mrs. Gable returned with a velvet box. From Mr. Rossi. He requests you wear this to dinner tonight. You will be meeting his capos. Clara opened the box. Inside rested a heavy, breathtaking diamond pendant. But beneath the necklace was a note written in sharp, elegant handwriting. Your father taught you to hide. Tonight you learn how to rule. The dining hall of the Rossi estate was designed for intimidation. A massive 20-foot oak table stretched across the room, illuminated by a low-hanging chandelier that cast sharp shadows across the faces of the men seated around it. These were the wolves of Chicago, Dominic's inner circle. There was Matteo, the silent giant. Lorenzo, the ruthless enforcer who handled the Rossi family's disposals, and several other captains who controlled the ports, the unions, and the clubs. When Clara arrived at the top of the stairs, her breath caught in her throat. She was wearing a custom-fitted deep crimson gown with a sweetheart neckline that accentuated her cleavage and draped elegantly over her hips, flowing to the floor. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever put on. Her dark hair had been swept up by a stylist Mrs. Gable brought in, leaving soft tendrils framing her face. For the first time in her life, Clara didn't feel like a monster. She felt present. But the moment she stepped into the dining room, the heavy masculine laughter ceased. Silence fell like a guillotine. The capos turned to look at her. Clara's newfound confidence instantly evaporated. She could read their eyes. They knew exactly who she was. Richard Moretti's fat, disgraced daughter. The punchline to a terrible joke. Her heart began to race her palms, sweating. She wanted to turn and run back to the safety of the master suite. Then Dominic stood up from the head of the table. He was wearing a black dress shirt with no tie, the top 2 buttons undone, exuding an aura of terrifying authority. The moment he moved, the tension in the room snapped into absolute deference. He didn't wait for her to come to him. Dominic walked the length of the room, stopping before her. His obsidian eyes swept over her, taking in the crimson dress, the diamonds at her throat, the terrified flutter of her pulse at the base of her neck. You look exquisite. He murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. He offered his arm. Clara took it, her hand shaking. He led her not to the far end of the table, but to the chair immediately to his right. The seat of the underboss, the seat of power. Lorenzo pulled the chair out for her. Clara sat down, keeping her eyes fixed on the empty china plate in front of her. Dominic took his seat at the head. Gentlemen, Dominic said, his voice carrying easily through the cavernous room. This is Clara. She will be my wife. You will extend to her the exact same loyalty, protection, and obedience that you give to me. A murmur of agreement went around the table, but Clara caught the slight hesitation. The dinner commenced. It was a tense affair, filled with quiet murmurs of business shipments, politicians' territory. Clara picked at her food, a beautifully seared scallop, feeling the weight of a dozen calculating stares. Halfway through the meal, the wine began to flow more freely. A capo named Carlo, an older man who had served under Dominic's uncle and felt entirely too comfortable, leaned back in his chair. He had been sneering at Clara all evening. I gotta say, boss, Carlo slurred, slightly swirling his red wine. I heard about the deal with Moretti. He owed us 15 mil to wipe that slate clean. I figured he gave you his little beauty queen. Sophia, write the model. The room went instantly, horrifyingly still. Matteo stopped chewing. Lorenzo's hand dropped beneath the table, resting on the handle of his weapon. Carlo chuckled, oblivious to the sudden drop in temperature. But hey, winter's coming right good to have a little extra insulation to keep the bed warm. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The familiar crushing weight of humiliation crashed down on her. She closed her eyes, fighting the desperate urge to cry. There it was, the reality. She was a joke. She gripped the fabric of her beautiful dress, waiting for Dominic to laugh along, to agree that she was merely a thick, pathetic substitute. Dominic didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He calmly set down his fork. The faint clink against the china sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Dominic reached for his linen napkin, wiped his mouth and tossed it onto the table. He stood up. Carlo's drunken smile finally faltered. "Ah, boss, I was just making a joke." Dominic moved so fast Clara barely registered it. He crossed the space between his chair and Carlo's in a heartbeat. He grabbed Carlo by the back of the neck and slammed his face downward into the heavy oak table. The sickening crunch of breaking cartilage echoed off the stone walls. Carlo screamed a muffled, bloody sound. Before the man could recoil, Dominic drew a serrated steak knife from the table setting and drove it directly through the back of Carlo's hand, pinning it to the wood. Several men jumped up. "Sit down!" Dominic roared. It was the first time Clara had heard him raise his voice, and it sounded like the wrath of God. Every man in the room instantly dropped back into their seats, terrified. Dominic leaned over the whimpering, bleeding capo. He twisted the knife exactly 1/4 inch. Carlo howled in agony. "I told you," Dominic whispered, his voice dripping with lethal malice. "You will extend to her the exact same respect you give to me. Do I look like a man who tolerates disrespect? Carlo." No, boss. No, God, please." "Clara is not a punchline," Dominic said, looking around the table, making eye contact with every single man. "She is the future queen of this syndicate. Anyone who thinks otherwise can join Carlo. Do we have an understanding?" A chorus of frantic, "Yes, boss," and "Understood," echoed around the room. Dominic ripped the knife out of Carlo's hand. "Get him out of my sight. If he ever sets foot in this house again, kill him." Lorenzo and another man immediately dragged a sobbing Carlo out of the dining room. A maid rushed in, terrified, and began frantically wiping the blood off the table. Dominic casually wiped the blood from his own hands with a fresh napkin, straightened his cuffs, and walked back to his seat at the head of the table. He sat down, picked up his fork, and looked at Clara. Her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. She was terrified of the violence she had just witnessed, yet beneath the terror, something else was blooming. Something fierce and undeniably powerful. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever demanded respect for her. Dominic met her wide, shocked eyes. His expression softened just a fraction. "Eat your dinner, Clara," he said gently. "Your food is getting cold." As she picked up her fork, her hand trembling, Clara realized the terrifying truth. Dominic Rossi didn't just want to use her to destroy her father. He was going to forge her into a weapon. And God help her, she wanted to let him. The weeks following the bloody dinner blurred into a bizarre, intoxicating new reality. Clara had expected to be a prisoner in the sprawling Vinetka mansion. Instead, Dominic treated her like his most trusted confidant. While her father had barred her from his study, Dominic left the doors to his office wide open. He didn't just want her presence, he demanded her intellect. Having spent a lifetime being ignored, Clara had become an expert observer. She knew the subtle tells of her father's associates, remembered offhand comments, and possessed a photographic memory for numbers skills her father had utilized for his bookkeeping, but never praised. One rainy Tuesday, Dominic sat across from her in the library, sliding a leather-bound ledger across the mahogany desk. "Look at the port shipments from the last quarter," he commanded, softly leaning back in his leather chair. Clara scanned the numbers, her brow furrowing. "The cargo weights don't match the fuel expenditure. Someone is underreporting the shipments from the Southside docks by at least 20%. They're skimming Dominic, and based on the routing numbers, they're laundering it through a shell company." Dominic's eyes flared with a dark, appreciative heat. He didn't smile, he rarely did, but the sheer respect radiating from him made Clara's pulse flutter. "Lorenzo!" Dominic called out, without breaking eye contact with her. The enforcer stepped out of the shadows. "Yes, boss." "Pay a visit to the harbour master. It seems we need to restructure his management style." Dominic finally smiled a dangerous curve of his lips. "You have a beautiful mind, Clara." A flush crept up her neck. Compliments from him still felt alien, but they no longer felt like a trap. Their dynamic was a delicate dance of power and protection. He never pushed her physically sleeping on his side of the massive king-sized bed, but his presence was a constant, heavy blanket of security. When she walked through the halls, the guards bowed their heads. When she spoke to the staff, her orders were executed immediately. The crushing anxiety of her past was being meticulously dismantled by the very man the city feared most. But the ultimate test arrived precisely 1 month after she had been given away. Tonight, the city's elite gathers for the mayor's charity gala at the Drake Hotel. Dominic announced over morning espresso. "We are attending, and so is your father." Clara's hand trembled, her cup clattering against the saucer. The thought of facing Richard and her golden child sister Sophia sent a spike of ice through her veins. "Dominic, please, I'm not ready." He reached across the table, his large, scarred hand covering her shaking fingers. "You will never be ready as long as you view yourself through their eyes. Tonight you show them who you belong to. And more importantly, you show them who you are." That evening, Mrs. Gable brought in a massive garment bag bearing the unmistakable logo of Christian Siriano, the renowned designer famous for crafting masterpieces for women of all sizes. When Clara stepped out of the dressing room, she didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. She wore a custom off-the-shoulder gown of midnight blue silk that hugged the generous curve of her hips before cascading into a dramatic train. The bodice was structured, pulling her waist in elegantly and pushing her shoulders back. A stunning sapphire choker rested against her collarbone. She looked powerful. She looked lethal. When she descended the staircase, Dominic stopped mid-conversation with Matteo. The mob boss went entirely still, his obsidian eyes trailing from the crown of her head to the hem of her gown. "You," he murmured, his voice thick with raw possession, "are a goddess of war." Arriving at the Drake Hotel was a spectacle. Flashbulbs erupted as Dominic Rossi stepped out of the Maybach, turning immediately to offer his hand to Clara. A collective gasp rippled through the paparazzi and the high society elites lingering by the gold-leafed entrance. No one had ever seen Dominic Rossi with a woman on his arm, and no one expected that woman to be Richard Moretti's hidden plus-sized daughter, looking like royalty. They entered the grand ballroom, a sea of crystal chandeliers and whispered secrets. It didn't take long for the vultures to circle. "Well, well, I see the hostage situation includes a makeover." Clara froze. The voice was unmistakable. She turned slowly to find her sister Sophia standing there in a skin-tight size 2 silver dress, clutching a flute of champagne. Beside her stood Richard, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt mixed with sudden jarring confusion at Clara's appearance. "Hello, Sophia. Father." Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered violently. Richard's eyes darted to Dominic, who stood silently beside Clara, a predator watching prey. "Rossi, I see you've managed to clean up the pig. I suppose if you throw enough money at a lost cause, it shines for a night." Dominic shifted his weight, the terrifying stillness washing over him. But before he could speak, Clara placed a gentle hand on his chest. "No," her touch communicated. "Let me." Clara took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and the man who had tormented her for 2 decades. You threw me away because you thought my body was a reflection of your failure, father. Clara said, her voice echoing coldly over the string quartet playing in the background. But the only failure in our family was a man so incompetent he had to steal from the Rossi syndicate to keep up appearances. Sophia scoffed, stepping forward. Don't act like you're suddenly important, Clara. He took you because he had to. You're just a debt settlement. The moment he's bored of pretending to stomach you, you'll be back on the street. Clara looked at her beautiful, cruel sister. For the first time, she didn't see perfection. She saw weakness. I am the future head of the Rossi family, Sophia. Clara said, stepping so close that Sophia instinctively leaned back. I wear diamonds that cost more than your fiancé's political campaign, and I command men who could make you disappear before the dessert is served. Do not speak to me as if we are equals. We are not. Richard turned purple with rage. You ungrateful fat! Finish that sentence, Richard, and I will cut your throat in front of the mayor. Dominic's voice was a low, terrifying rasp. He stepped up beside Clara, wrapping a possessive arm around her waist and pulling her flush against his side. The warmth of his body radiated through her silk dress. Clara is my queen. Dominic stated, his eyes boring into Richard's terrified face. And tonight, I am officially calling in the rest of your debts. Every property, every offshore account, every dime you have left. By morning, you will be bankrupt. Richard gasped, his champagne glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. We had a deal, I gave you her. You gave me a diamond in the rough. Dominic smiled, cold and merciless. But you still owe me for the insult of thinking she was worthless. Enjoy the gala, Richard. It's the last high society event you'll ever afford. Dominic turned on his heel, guiding Clara away. As they walked through the parting crowd, Clara looked up at him, a fierce, blazing fire igniting in her chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was winning. The euphoria of the gala was a powerful narcotic, but, in the Mafia piece, is always a fragile illusion. 2 days after Richard's financial ruin became public knowledge, a torrential downpour battered the Winnetka estate. Dominic had been called away to a sit-down with the New York families, leaving Clara with Matteo and a heavily fortified guard detail. Clara was in the library, poring over the syndicate's logistics files. She had fully integrated herself into Dominic's operations, finding a profound sense of purpose in organizing his chaotic, blood-soaked empire into a streamlined corporate machine. She was interrupted by Mrs. Gable, who looked unusually perturbed. Miss Clara, there is a visitor at the gates. It's your sister. She is demanding to see Mr. Rossi, but upon hearing he is out, she demanded to see you. She says it is a matter of life and death. Clara's eyes narrowed. Sophia never did anything that didn't directly benefit herself. Let her in, Mrs. Gable. Have Matteo wait outside the doors. Minutes later, Sophia burst into the library. She was soaked, her designer trench coat ruined her mascara, running down her porcelain face. The perfect golden child looked entirely unhinged. Clara! Sophia cried out, rushing forward. You have to help us. Dad is losing his mind. He's packing his bags, talking about fleeing to South America. He's broke, Clara. The feds are sniffing around his legitimate businesses now. Clara leaned back in Dominic's heavy leather chair, steepling her fingers. Actions have consequences, Sophia. He dug his own grave. Sophia slammed her hands on the desk. You're a monster. You let him do this to us. You let that thug ruin our family. He isn't ruining our family, Clara replied calmly. He's punishing a thief who threw me to the wolves to save himself. What exactly did you expect me to do? Sophia's expression shifted, the desperation melting into a calculating, venomous sneer. You think you're so secure, don't you? You think a man like Dominic Rossi actually wants a woman who looks like you. Look at yourself, Clara. He's using you to punish Dad. Once he gets what he wants, he'll discard you. But I can fix this. Clara raised an eyebrow. Oh, and how do you propose to do that? I know men, Sophia said, straightening her posture, wiping the fake tears from her cheeks. If I go to Dominic, if I offer him what he really wants, what he should have gotten in the first place, he'll let Dad off the hook. I'm willing to sacrifice myself for the family, Clara. I'll give him an heir. I'll give him the beautiful wife he deserves to have on his arm. A sickening silence filled the room. Clara stared at her sister, genuinely appalled by the sheer audacity and delusion. Sophia truly believed her body was a master key that could unlock any door, even one guarded by a monster like Dominic. But Clara wasn't the weak, insecure girl she was a month ago. She didn't cry. She didn't shrink. She laughed. It was a dark, hollow sound that made Sophia flinch. You think you can seduce the devil, Sophia? Clara asked, standing up. She walked around the desk, her presence heavy and commanding. You think Dominic wants a pretty empty shell who would sell out her own fiancé for a comfortable lifestyle. You don't know the first thing about power. We'll see about that, Sophia spat. Before Clara could have Matteo throw her sister out, Clara's mind caught on something Sophia had said. Dad is packing his bags, talking about fleeing. Richard was broke. Fleeing required cash, a lot of it. The feds had frozen his accounts. Where was he getting the money to run? Get out, Sophia, Clara said sharply, before I have Matteo drag you out by your hair. As Sophia stormed out, screaming curses, Clara rushed to the computer terminal. She logged into her father's old private server. She had built his encrypted networks years ago. He never changed the passwords, assuming she was too stupid to ever use them against him. She bypassed the firewalls in minutes. She scoured his recent communications looking for burner accounts or hidden crypto wallets. Then she found it. It wasn't a bank account. It was a communication log on a dark web encrypted messaging app. Richard wasn't just fleeing. He was selling information. He had provided the blueprints of Dominic's South Side warehouse, where millions in untraceable weapons were stored, to the Calabrese family, Dominic's most violent rivals in the city. The payment for the blueprints was scheduled for tonight. Clara's blood ran cold. The $15 million debt was a smoke screen. Richard had been feeding the Calabrese family information for months to undermine Dominic, causing the bad real estate deal on purpose to launder Calabrese money. Her father hadn't just insulted the Rossi family. He had committed high treason against the syndicate. She grabbed her phone and hit Dominic's private number. It rang once before his deep voice answered, cutting through the background noise of rain and a revving engine. Clara, is everything all right? Dominic, she breathed, her voice urgent. Where are you? Just crossed city limits, heading back to the estate. The New York meeting ended early. Why are you hurt? The sudden spike of lethal panic in his voice was palpable. No, I'm fine, Clara said, gripping the edge of the desk. But you need to divert your men to the South Side warehouse immediately. The Calabrese family is hitting it tonight. My father sold them the blueprints. There was a heavy, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. Are you certain? Dominic asked. I'm looking at the encrypted logs right now, Clara said, her voice turning to steel. He's meeting a Calabrese capo at the docks in 2 hours to collect his payment and flee. Clara, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating pure, unadulterated violence. Your father is blood. If I do what needs to be done tonight, There is no coming back from it. Are you with me, or are you with your family?" Clara looked around the grand library, thinking of the man who had dragged her by her arm, called her a pig, and treated her like trash. Then she thought of the man on the phone, who had crowned her in diamonds and handed her his empire. "My family is dead to me," Clara said flawlessly. "Burn him to the ground, Dominic." "Good girl," he whispered. The line went dead. The Southside docks were a graveyard of rust and rain. By the time Matteo's SUV tore through the chain-link gates of Warehouse 42, the chaotic symphony of automatic gunfire had already faded into the steady, dreary rhythm of the Chicago storm. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her heart beating a slow, methodical drum in her chest. She wasn't trembling anymore. The girl who had hidden in oversized cardigans was dead. The woman who stepped out of the armored vehicle wore a tailored black trench coat and a gaze as cold as the lake wind. Inside the cavernous warehouse, the smell of cordite wet concrete and copper hung thick in the air. The Rossi syndicate had turned the Calabrese ambush into a slaughter. Bodies in dark suits littered the floor among the shipping crates, outsmarted and outgunned, because Clara had seen the trap before it could spring. At the center of the carnage, beneath the harsh, buzzing glare of a single halogen floodlight, stood Dominic. His midnight suit was ruined, splashed with the dark crimson of his enemies, and he held a heavy steel crowbar in his right hand. Kneeling on the blood-slicked concrete before him was Richard Moretti. Richard was a pathetic sight. The former titan of high society was sobbing his face, bruised his expensive loafers, soaked in the blood of the Calabrese capos he had foolishly trusted. A heavy iron chain bound his wrists behind his back. Clara's heels clicked sharply against the concrete as she approached. Richard's head snapped up at the sound. His swollen eyes widened in absolute disbelief as Clara stepped into the circle of light. She didn't look away from him. She stood beside Dominic, the towering mob boss, instinctively shifting to shield her from the worst of the gore, though he knew she didn't need it. "Clara," Richard choked out, coughing up a spatter of blood. "Clara, please, tell him it was a mistake. I was forced, they threatened me." "Stop lying, Father," Clara said, her voice cutting through the damp warehouse air like a surgical blade. "I read the encrypted logs. I bypassed the firewalls on your private server. I watched you negotiate the price of my fiancé's life." Richard froze, the color completely draining from his battered face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The daughter he had deemed too stupid, too fat and too worthless to acknowledge, had been the one to orchestrate his absolute destruction. "You," Richard whispered, horrified. "You did this to me." "You did this to yourself," Clara corrected, her tone devoid of any familial warmth. "You built an empire on arrogance and theft. You thought you could sell me to a monster and walk away clean. But you were wrong about two things. Dominic is not a monster to those who are loyal to him, and I am not the weak, pathetic pig you raised me to be." Dominic looked at Clara, his chest heaving slightly from the adrenaline of the firefight, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of awe and ravenous pride. He dropped the crowbar. It clanged loudly against the floor. He drew the heavy matte black pistol from his shoulder holster. "I offered you mercy once, Richard," Dominic said, racking the slide with a sharp metallic crack. "I took your insult. I took your daughter. I wiped your slate clean. And in return, you brought the Calabrese rats to my door." "Dominic, please!" Richard screamed, thrashing against the chains. "I'm your father-in-law. You can't do this. Sophia will give you anything you want. I can get you political power. I have the senator on my payroll." "I don't need a senator," Dominic replied, stepping closer, casting a towering shadow over the broken man. And I already have the only Moretti I will ever want. Dominic turned his head, slightly locking eyes with Clara. The unspoken question hung heavily in the air. Do I end it? He was giving her the power. He was giving her the final say over the man who had tormented her for 24 years. Clara looked down at her father. She felt no pity. She felt no grief. She felt nothing but the liberating emptiness of a chain finally snapping. You always told me I took up too much space. Father, Clara said quietly, now I am going to take up the whole city, and you are not going to be here to see it. She looked at Dominic and gave a single resolute nod. Goodbye, Richard, Dominic whispered. The gunshot was deafening. It echoed off the corrugated steel roof, loud and final. Clara didn't flinch. She watched her father's body slump forward against the wet concrete, the tyrannical ghost of her past, exorcised in a single flash of muzzle fire. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of rain pounding against the roof. Dominic holstered his weapon. He didn't check on the body. Lorenzo and Matteo were already moving in to handle the disposal. Instead, Dominic stepped toward Clara. He reached out his blood-stained hands, stopping just inches from her face, suddenly hyper-aware of the violence he was covered in. He hesitated, not wanting to taint her. But Clara closed the distance. She reached up, wrapping her hands around his thick wrists, and pulled his palms to her cheeks. The contrast of the blood against her pale skin didn't frighten her. It was a baptism. Are you okay? Dominic asked, his voice, a gravelly protective rumble. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Clara answered, her eyes locking onto his. Dominic's control finally snapped. He crushed his mouth against hers, kissing her with a fierce, possessive desperation. It wasn't a kiss of a business transaction or a mafia arrangement. It was the raw, undeniable collision of two people who had found their perfect equal in the darkest corners of the world. Clara kissed him back just as fiercely, burying her hands in his dark hair, the taste of rain and victory on their lips. 6 months later, the Chicago skyline glittered like a bed of scattered diamonds beneath a crisp autumn moon. The Rossi syndicate had never been stronger. With the Calabrese family leaderless and crippled, Dominic had absorbed their territories in a matter of weeks. But the true engine behind the Rossi family's unprecedented financial boom was not a man with a gun. It was a woman with a ledger. Clara had completely restructured the syndicate's laundering operations. She diversified their assets, buying up massive swathes of commercial real estate under impenetrable shell companies. She commanded the loyalty of Dominic's capos, not just out of fear of her husband, but out of sheer, unadulterated respect for her intellect. They quickly learned that crossing Clara Rossi was financially and physically fatal. The city's elite had also learned a harsh lesson. The exclusive clubs, the high society galas, the luxury boutiques, they all belonged to the Rossis now. On a Saturday night, outside of the Azure Chicago's newest and most exclusive underground nightclub, a desperate scene was unfolding. Sophia Moretti stood in the biting wind, shivering in a cheap knockoff dress she had bought from a discount retailer. Her blonde hair was frizzy, her perfect makeup ruined by the damp cold. Without her father's stolen money, the state senator's son had dumped her in a matter of days. The bank had foreclosed on their estate, and Sophia had been forced to move into a tiny studio apartment in the suburbs, working as a hostess to survive. "Please," Sophia begged the massive bouncer, her teeth chattering. "I used to be a VIP here. You know who I am. Just let me inside for an hour. I need to find—" "Your name isn't on the list, lady." The bouncer grunted, stepping squarely in front of the velvet rope. "Move along before I call the cops." Before Sophia could protest, a fleet of 3 black armored SUVs pulled up to the curb. The street instantly went quiet. The bouncer straightened up immediately, unhooking the velvet rope. Matteo stepped out of the lead car, scanning the street with hawkish intensity. Then Dominic emerged from the center vehicle, looking like a god of the underworld in a bespoke charcoal suit. He turned and offered his hand. Clara stepped onto the pavement. She was a vision. She wore a skin-tight, emerald-green velvet dress that celebrated every curve, her dark hair cascading in glamorous waves over her shoulders. A massive, flawless diamond, her wedding ring, caught the neon lights of the club. She radiated power, confidence, and untouchable grace. Sophia froze her breath, catching in her throat. "Clara," she whispered, stepping forward instinctively. "Clara, wait." Clara paused, glancing over her shoulder. She looked at her sister. She saw the desperation, the faded glory, the bitter reality of a woman whose only currency had expired. There was no anger left in Clara's heart for Sophia. There was only absolute glacial indifference. Clara didn't say a word. She didn't gloat. She simply turned her head back to her husband, who wrapped a heavy protective arm around her waist. "Everything all right, my queen?" Dominic murmured, kissing the temple of her head as they walked toward the entrance. "Perfectly fine," Clara smiled, leaning into his warmth. They walked into the club, the heavy mahogany door shutting firmly behind them, leaving Sophia out in the cold, invisible and entirely forgotten. Up in the private VIP lounge, overlooking the pulsing dance floor, Dominic poured them 2 glasses of rare bourbon. He handed one to Clara, stepping close so that there was no space between them. The thumping bass of the music vibrated through the floorboards, but in their corner of the room, they existed in a universe of their own making. "The port acquisition went through this morning," Clara noted, swirling the amber liquid. "The unions signed the contracts. The waterfront is officially ours." Dominic didn't look at the paperwork she gestured to. He was too busy looking at her. His obsidian eyes traced the slope of her neck, the generous curve of her hips, the fierce, brilliant fire in her eyes that he had drawn out of the shadows. "I don't care about the waterfront right now," Dominic said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that always made her pulse race. He took the glass from her hand and set it on the table along with his own. He pulled her flush against his chest, his large hands resting possessively on her waist. "Your father thought he was giving me a punishment," Dominic whispered, pressing his lips against her jawline, causing a shiver to cascade down her spine. "He thought he was handing me a burden. He didn't realize he was handing me the key to the city." Clara tilted her head back, allowing him access to her neck, a soft gasp escaping her lips. "I thought my life was over the night he gave me to you." "It was," Dominic replied fiercely, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a burning, absolute devotion. "The life of the girl who hid in the dark is over, but the reign of the queen, that is just beginning." He kissed her, a deep, consuming claim that promised violence to her enemies and absolute worship to her. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, knowing that she had finally found exactly where she belonged. She wasn't a bargaining chip. She wasn't a joke. She was Clara Rossi, the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld, and she would never shrink herself for anyone ever again. If this story of betrayal, ruthless mafia justice, and undeniable romance kept you on the edge of your seat, you are not going to want to miss what we have coming next. Clara went from a discarded pawn to the terrifying Queen of Chicago, proving that the best revenge is absolute power. Did you love seeing Dominic completely worship her while destroying her enemies? Drop a comment below with your favorite moment. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this with your fellow dark romance lovers, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another thrilling story.